Long before the One Ring, before Gondor, before Mordor, there was another war. A war so huge that it broke continents, drowned kingdoms, and threw a dark lord into the void. This is the War of Wrath, the final battle of the First Age, the day the gods themselves came to Middle-earth, and from the ashes of that war, a new world rose, with new heroes and a new Dark Lord. Let's go back to the moment when everything was on the edge of being lost. By the end of the First Age, Morgoth had basically won. The great elven kingdoms of the north had fallen. Doriath was shattered. The havens of the Falas were gone. The lands of Beleriand were crawling with orcs, wolves, and worse. Morgoth sat in his fortress of Angband, deep under the triple peaks of Thangorodrim, ruling a broken world. His enemies were scattered remnants, living in hiding or clinging to a few last refugees. One of those refugees was Gondolin, the hidden city in the mountains. Another was the havens at the Mouth of Sirion, where refugees from other destroyed realms had gathered. And in the middle of all this suffering stood one man with a cursed destiny, Eärendil. Eärendil was the son of a mortal man and an elf woman. Elwing was the granddaughter of Beren and Luthien, and the bearer of one of the Silmarils stolen from Morgoth. They lived at the Mouth of Sirion, a fragile last refuge where elves and men tried to survive under Morgoth's shadow. But even here, the old sins of the elves followed them. The sons of Fëanor, still bound by the oath to reclaim the Silmarils at any cost, attacked the havens. This was the third kinslaying, elves murdering elves again, just to chase a jewel. In the chaos, Elwing faced a choice: give up the Silmaril, or lose everything. She chose something else. Instead of surrendering it, she threw herself into the sea with the jewel. But she did not die. The Valor of the Waters, Ulmo, transformed her into a white bird, still carrying the Silmaril. Through storm and darkness she flew, searching for Eärendil, who was at sea, trying to find a way to the Blessed Realm. Eärendil saw the bird, glowing faintly with the light of the Silmaril, and brought it onto his ship. When he woke, the bird was gone. In its place stood Elwing. Together, they made a decision that would change the fate of the world. They would sail west. Not just for themselves, but for all elves and men still suffering under Morgoth. In theory, sailing to Valinor was forbidden. The Valar had hidden their land from mortal eyes. The Noldor who had rebelled and left Aemon were banished. Coming back without permission was, in the old rules, a death sentence. But those rules were written for a different time. By the time Eärendil and Elwing reached the shores of Valinor, most of those original rebels were dead. What remained in Middle-earth were their children, and the children of men who had fought Morgoth for generations. They had inherited a war they did not start. Eärendil went inland to the shining city of Valimar and stood before the Valar. He came not as a thief, but as an envoy. He asked for three things: mercy for the Noldor, pity for the suffering of men, and help against Morgoth. The Valar listened. For centuries they had held back, letting elves and men fight their own battles against the Shadow. But now they saw what Middle-earth had become under Morgoth, and who was paying the price. This time they decided to act. The answer to Eärendil's prayer was not a council or a prophecy. It was an army. The host of Valinor was assembled. The Vanyar, the fairest and most devoted of the elves, under Ingwion. The Noldor of Aman, who had never left, under Finarfin. Countless Maiar, the angelic spirits who served the Valar. And at their head, Eärendil, herald of Manwë, the commander of the host. The Teleri, the sea elves who had once lost kin in the first kinslaying, agreed to ferry the army across the sea, though many of them refused to fight on land. This was not a raid. It was not a small intervention. This was the full power of the West moving toward Middle-earth. For Morgoth, it would feel like the sky itself was about to fall. When the host of Valinor landed in the west of Beleriand, the ground itself shook. In some versions of the tale, Morgoth expected an attack and tried to block the landings. In others, his pride blinded him, and the host arrived almost unopposed. Either way, soon the result was the same. War. Not the small, desperate battles that mortals had been fighting. This was something on a different scale. Armies of elves in shining armor. Standard-bearers of Valinor. Mire cloaked in light and fire. Against them stood Morgoth's legions. Unnumbered hosts of orcs. Wolves and wargs. Trolls and corrupted creatures. Men from the east, who had thrown in their lot with the Dark Lord. The fighting spread across the north of Beleriand. Rivers were turned red. Mountains echoed with the clash of steel and the roars of monsters. For decades, the war dragged on. The lands that had once held proud kingdoms became a burning battlefield. Slowly, the host of Valinor pushed Morgoth back. Step by step, they fought toward Angband, his ancient fortress in the north, and that is when Morgoth played his last, terrible card. Up to this point, every dragon in Middle-earth had fought on the ground. They were devastating, but at least they still obeyed the rules of gravity. Morgoth changed that. In his desperation, he released a new, horror-winged dragons. These were not just big lizards with fire. They were living weapons of mass destruction that could fly, rain fire from above, and break any formation. At their head was Ankalagan the Black, the greatest of all dragons. So vast and powerful that later tales would say his fall reshaped mountains. When the winged dragons burst from Angband, the tide of the war turned. The host of Valinor, which had been closing in on victory, was suddenly pushed back. Elven ranks shattered under fire from the sky. Even the Maiar struggled against a storm of wings and flame. For a moment, it looked like history might repeat itself. Another hopeless war against the Dark Lord. Another defeat. But this time, someone else was watching the sky. Above the armies, above the dragons, another battle began. Eärendil and the eagles against Ankalagan and the winged fire drakes. They fought for a full day and a full night. The sky over Angband became a storm of fire and light. Below, the host of Valinor held out, battered but not broken. At last, as dawn approached, Eärendil struck Ankalagan down. The great dragon fell from the sky onto the mountains of Thangorodrim, shattering their towers in his ruin. With their leader destroyed, the remaining winged dragons broke and fled or were cut down. The last hope of Morgoth's army burned away with them. With the dragons defeated, there was nothing left to stop the host of Valinor. They stormed Angband. The dungeons where countless elves and men had been enslaved were broken open. The black pits where balrogs and monsters had slept were torn apart. Some say a few balrogs escaped, fleeing into the deep roots of the world to hide until later ages. Most were destroyed. Morgoth himself did not stand in front of his armies. The once great Vala had poured so much of his power into corrupting the world, into orcs and dragons and darkness, that his own form was weakened. He was no longer the towering figure of the beginning, but a shadow clinging to armor and fear. When the host finally reached him, he did not die gloriously in battle. He hid. He tried to bargain, to beg, to ask for peace and terms. None of that mattered. His feet were cut out from under him. He was bound once again with Angband, the chain forged long ago by Aule. The two remaining Silmarils were taken from his crown. Later, their story would lead to more tragedy for the last sons of Feanor. As for Morgoth, the judgment was final. He was cast out of the world through the door of night, into the timeless void beyond the walls of the world. The first Dark Lord was gone. But the price of that victory was almost unimaginable. The War of Wrath was not a clean, precise conflict. It was like watching gods and monsters tear up the map. So much power was unleashed, by Morgoth, by dragons, by the Valar, that the land itself broke. Rivers changed course. Mountains fell. Valleys caved in. Shortly after Morgoth's defeat, most of Beleriand sank beneath the sea. The great kingdoms of the First Age, Doriath, Gondolin, Nargothrond, Hithlum, were gone not just politically, but physically. Their ruins lay under the waves, their names fading into legend. The people who survived had two choices. Some went west, back to Aman, now forgiven after long exile. Others stayed in the mortal lands, moving eastward into new regions that would one day be called Lindon, Eärendil, Rovanion, and beyond. Among those who stayed were Gil-galad, Círdan, Galadriel, Elrond. They would become some of the key players of the Second Age. And men were not forgotten either. For their faithfulness in fighting against Morgoth, the Edain were given a gift. A great island in the Western Sea. It would be called Númenor. From that island would come mariners, kings, and eventually new trouble. Because darkness is never fully done. Morgoth was gone. But not everything he did could be undone by chains and banishment. His corruption had soaked into the very matter of the world. Every cruel choice, every twisted creature, every ruined land carried a fragment of his legacy. And one servant of his was still free, his greatest lieutenant. A Maya who had once served the Valar in fairness, then turned to Morgoth's side. His name was Sauron. When the host of Valinor came, Sauron did not fight to the end. He slipped away into the shadows and chose not to surrender. In the ages to come, he would rebuild the shadow in a new form, forges in Mordor, rings of power, dark towers, and wars that would haunt the Second and Third Age. The War of Wrath ended one story, but it also lit the fuse for the next. There is one more piece of lore whispered in later ages. Some prophecies say that Morgoth is not absolutely gone. He waits beyond the world, gnawing at its edges, and one day he will break through again. That final war is called the Dagor Dagorath, the Battle of All Battles. In some versions, the children of Ilúvatar will stand together. Elves, men, and dwarves. Even heroes long dead, like Turin Turambar, may return to face the dark enemy one last time. The world will be broken and remade. The lands of Beleriand will rise again, and the music that began the world will be sung a second time, now with elves and men joining in. Whether that will ever happen inside the story, we do not know. But for us, looking back, we can say this. The War of Wrath was the day the First Age ended in fire and water. It tore down the first Dark Lord. It drowned a continent, and from that destruction came the setup for everything that follows. Númenor, Sauron, the Rings of Power, Gondor, Arnor, and finally a small hobbit finding a ring in the dark. The world that Frodo walks in is a world built on the ruins of the War of Wrath. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, a ship still sails the sky with a Silmaril on its bow, and a mariner who once asked the gods to save a world that had almost given up.